Before we delve into the risks of AI, existing global frameworks and different regulatory approaches to facilitate responsible AI, we need to address one very specific and one very core concern, the diversity challenge in AI. A recent study published by the AI Now Institute of New York University in 2020 concluded that the absence of a diverse workforce has resulted in AI systems that perpetuate gender and racial biases. The report found that more than 80% of AI professors are men, and only 15% of AI researchers at Facebook are women. Further, or even worse, is only 10% of AI researchers at Google are women. In your opening remarks, as I discussed, we would like you to just share your insights to addressing what is a global challenge across the AI product development and management cycle. I think we'll kick off with Prateek Sibal. If I can hand over to you, please.
Thanks, Raj, for the introductions, and also it's a great pleasure to be in conversation with all of you. I see it's a really diverse cohort, and looking forward to engaging and learning from everyone's insights. Before we dive into the global debates, I think first thing is when we talk about global discussions and we then cite data coming from the United States. So we need to first also question how we frame the discussion. We need data on diversity and inclusion, and it's not only racial and gender, but beyond that as well. For instance, in India, we can also talk about caste and class distinctions, regional, linguistic. We have indigenous cultures and languages globally. We need to talk beyond that and not frame the global debate based on what is happening in the US. So I think that is one important aspect. Going ahead, at UNESCO, we've been kind of working on multi-stakeholder approaches to governance of AI. And this finds roots in the whole discussion around internet governance from over the past 20 years, where there is a lot of emphasis on how to ensure inclusion and diversity in the setting up of technical standards, in governance standards, and just every aspect of this wider digital domain that we have. We've seen the consequences, for instance, and kind of reverting to examples now from some of the big tech companies, setting up automated hiring algorithms and then relying on data from past 10 years of CVs. And then if there is the kind of a phrase like women chess club champion, that CV being downgraded. So there is a bias coming from there, not only in terms of, there are two kinds of biases, entry points, I would say, from data and from programmer driven. So especially when we talk about programmers, we need to ensure that our workspaces are more inclusive. We should ensure probably not just equality, but equality of opportunity. A lot of times when we have these kind of discussions, we would invite researchers from different backgrounds, but at the same time, not take into account the kind of the labor that goes into it, and the cost of it is different for different people. So it's not just about having this inclusive multi-stakeholder approach, but also giving it legs through channelizing funding for it. And creating solidarity networks where this kind of we can vouch for each other and have people who are not represented be part of these conversations with adequate support, and not just be part, oh, we invited, but no one said. Of course, the opportunities are not the same for everyone. So I think at the heart of technology development, it is important to have diversity and inclusion and give it legs through funding support, through networks, through sharing the platform. And I wouldn't go into the examples. I think we are quite generally aware of what are the manifestations of this, whether it's in prison systems or elsewhere.
Yeah, I mean, I think I completely agree that when we talk about Western, as Prateek mentioned, it shouldn't be the US and our data shouldn't come from there. And I think even when we talk about, oh, what should be the development of like AI platforms in India, I mean, we have to realize where we are in India right now is sort of very far away from like discussions in the US. So I'm not sure it's right at this stage to, continuously compare ourselves, because there is also a general societal understanding that has to sort of come about before I think you can have regulation that will actually truly be effective. I mean, in India, we still do not have a personal data protection bill, right? And yes, questions of gender and like racial bias in AI are very prominent in the West. Unfortunately, they haven't reached that similar salience in India. And in India, this becomes particularly important when we see facial recognition technologies being automated. And I mean, I think in India, the law enforcement context is really where the development in AI is sort of happening in a way that's very troublesome. So you have automated facial, AFRS systems, automated facial technology regulation systems that are being deployed by state police everywhere. And especially, some states like Telangana, et cetera, have been very, very active in promoting these FRT systems. And when you look at not just, when we talk about bias and, sort of the gender diversity bias and those biases, you also have to look at, even assume our AI was completely accurate. The biases within the policing system, the biases, whether we talk about, where these policing systems are being deployed, where the predictive policing is being deployed. What is your historical data that is looking at, these are places which are high in crime? I mean, is that going to be a white collar neighborhood or a blue collar neighborhood? Is that a Hindu neighborhood or a Muslim neighborhood? And so I think when we have those sorts of conversations, I mean, accuracy is important, but I think when we especially look at it in a law enforcement context and the kind of lack of transparency that we have to also, solving the accuracy problem is not going to de-bias the otherwise sort of embedded biases in AI. And I think that's why conversations in India have to sort of, in the West, we're seeing, moratoriums on law enforcement use of AI, even whether you look at what is classified as high risk in the, EU AI framework. But in India, we're not at that stage yet. And I think we are seeing in India, in fact, an increase in the use of CCTV cameras. We're seeing an increase in the use of facial recognition technology being deployed. And that is seen as this perfect good, which is going to solve all crime. And, things that are deployed for one purpose. So for finding missing children, for instance, then get expanded. And the final thing is, this is a question I've asked a lot of people, and I haven't really ever gotten a perfect answer, which is in all these FRT systems, what is our training data? Is our training data sort of like Western data? Is it like Indian data? Is it, whose names are on these lists under which like your 1:1 identification is going to happen? So, also if anybody has any answers to that, I would sort of love to know. But I think in India, the conversations are slightly different. So to that extent, I completely agree with Prateek.
Right. Well, thank you so much. I mean, it was, really interesting to build on that. And Laetitia, if I can bring you in, obviously, perhaps maybe tackling a legal perspective, given your background, like what are some of the challenges that we see, obviously, within the context of eradicating gender and racial biases?
Yeah, so hi everyone, it's great to be here, and echoing Prateek, sorry, I don't know how to say it very well, but Prateek, what he said, it's great to be here with such a diverse group. And actually, I'd first like to say that just because 80% of AI professors are men, for example, doesn't mean that the men are the issue. Men, as we can see, can look at these issues and actually question them. And I think that that's something that we need to think more about, is this reflection on current structures. So what I mean is that actually UNESCO did a report that was called I'd Blush If I Could, which was about Siri. If she called Siri, I don't know if I'm allowed to swear, but the B word, then Siri would respond with, I'd blush if I could, which is just, it's not okay for Siri, who is seen as this female voice assistant, to act in a way that's very disempowering to women. And maybe I have no idea, but maybe some women were involved in this. I don't know, but I'm just saying that sometimes we need to look at which social structure we might be reproducing and amplifying, which is something that I really wanted to first bring up. Then the second is actually it's really important to look at the current structures of our society, which is that actually, if we do have representative data, it might be skewed. There is constant discrimination in this world. There's constant, ableism. There's constant white men being part of the discourse, for example. So do we actually want to repeat this? I think is also a good question. And Vrinda, I don't have an answer about what is used for training data, but coming from, I work a lot with social roboticists, and what I found with programmers is that we tend to have a bit of a privilege hazard. We've all gone to university, be it a bachelor's, maybe master's, maybe even PhD. That does not represent society, yet their choices will affect the entire world. And they use themselves as being like, okay, so what is the issue in this world that I want to rectify? And so all these things mean that sometimes they reproduce biases in gender, in race, in a whole load of questions. And unfortunately, right now, as it stands, the law doesn't really explain how to deal with these structures when they do receive the data. How do they critically assess it to know how not to reproduce it? And for me, that's something that's really major. It's something that really needs to be taken into account.
Thank you very much. Vasudha, if I can bring you in here, obviously working with Wadhwani, AI for social good, right? Like that's the a goal for this technology, to be able to apply it for social and non-profit benefits and to see some real tangible value out of it. But obviously, we're discussing what is quite a serious issue that is impacting that applicability, the application of that tool. Any thoughts on how we can sort of tackle that?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'd like to take a step back from the conversation that's going on and talk a little bit about what AI is. I think fairly everyone must know what AI does today. It's trying to automate certain decisions that human beings would otherwise take. But what we don't know is the way an AI algorithm learns is not very different from how a human being learns. So when a baby is born and you need to teach it what is an apple versus what is an orange, very simple problem statement, you would tend to just show it pictures of apples and oranges and then say, hey, this is an apple, this is an apple, this is an apple. And then assume that after showing him X number of photographs, he or she would be able to call that picture an apple. And that's exactly how a machine learning model would learn. The difference here is that data is not just data, right? It's got to be labeled data and annotated data that you feed to a model today. So a similar model that had to distinguish between apples and oranges would take in a lot of photographs of apples labeled as apple as well as oranges, and then eventually be able to make a decision. So eventually, once you fed it 1,000 images of training data, you could test it out with 20 images and 20 apple images. Every time it calls it an apple, that's dictating the precision of that particular model. And this is computer vision for you, right? Computer vision has multiple applications. We've talked about facial recognition being one of the key applications of computer vision across different industries. So here's where it gets tricky, right? Facial recognition would then depend upon how much good data exists for a certain particular kind of classification. So here's where it gets really tricky, because if I were to distinguish between apples, oranges, and bananas, for example, and for some reason I did not have enough photographs of banana, it's not going to give me good outputs on banana. And that's what's been happening specifically with facial recognition with Black females. You see that their accuracy is about 20% lower than the average accuracy of the algorithm. Now, of course, this is problematic, but the way to fix it, several people have talked about wanting to inculcate this on the data front itself. There's a lot that can be done, right? I worked, while at Microsoft, I worked on a project with Kotak Bank, and they were using facial recognition to add a layer of authentication to the internet banking process. And this Vrinda might answer your question to a certain extent. No banks were ready to share any data with us to even build the model to start with. So how we went about it was we crowdsourced the data. So as we crowdsourced the data, we ensured that every particular cohort that this bank would have customers of, age, gender, skin type, etc. All of these were included as a part of our crowdsourcing data collection activity, and that is what fed to the model. So here at Wadhwani, we take this very, very seriously, not just biasing, but also data protection and data privacy. And a few of the other ways, apart from just data collection and auditing, there are a lot of model post-processing techniques that you can do to reduce biasing in your model. But the key challenge is that you have to be aware of which cohorts are actually sensitive to your model. And that is not something researchers can do alone. I think this is again similar to Laetitia, what you called out. Researchers can't do this alone. Every institution that wants to build AI models needs to have domain experts sitting alongside those researchers who can call out what are the social implications of what their work might be and guide them accordingly about how to solve for that.
Thank you, Vasudha. So obviously there's a technical element to the complex, philosophical discussion that we're having, and how can we solve the problems, either improving the data collection or increasing the scope of collection for that data. Tarunima, you work at the intersection of, technology and policy, obviously trying to bring the two together, which, I don't envy your task. I think that's quite a difficult thing to do and has always been. Do you have any thoughts on the conversation so far?
Yeah, plenty. So again, thank you so much for having me here, and thank you for all the people who've spoken before me. Some of you I know, and some of you I'm meeting for the first time. So thank you for setting the stage so well. So one I'd say is that I think we need to maybe I don't. I'd like to maybe characterize AI a little differently, right? So one of the things is that so Vasudha, I think you were just describing this model where humans learn, babies learn by looking at examples, and we teach them things like we give them a bunch of examples of apples and oranges, and then they begin to distinguish. Now that's actually what is, if you look historically on like theories of learning, that's the B.F. Skinner, the Skinnerian behaviorism model of learning, right? And then you had Chomsky come and say that that's not how humans learn. We basically have this idea of universal models, right? And so in some ways, I think perhaps if we should distinguish in how humans and machines learn, because I think that leads to possibly more responsible and more nuanced in some ways conversations, right? Because just in a similar discussion it's similar to this one, a specific computer scientist who's also a mother, was very sort of disturbed by this characterization, because she was like, that's not how my children learn, right? And so I don't have that experience and I can't comment on it, but I think we should at least make that distinction, because I think what we're saying is I don't think AI is at that point where even some of the examples that we were evoking of, let's say, Terminator, and we're not really at that point, right? That's general AI. We're not there. We're really talking about narrow AI at this point. And with narrow AI, like it's I think some of the concerns we need to worry about are more about like I guess machines being dumb than machines being too smart, and machines doing really, really silly things. And a lot of people being hurt because of certain I guess machines just making very stupid mistakes. So I think with that background, one of the things we've discussed so many like challenges and so many issues. Diversity in the pipeline is definitely a challenge, and I as someone who also is trying to hire in the machine learning space, it's a really difficult challenge to solve, right? And part of the reason for that is because you cannot invent and sort of build hiring pipelines within like 5 years. So I think this conversation on diversity, and it's great. I think STS scholars would have been mentioning about diversity in the 1990s, but it never came across as strongly as it has come with AI or machine learning, because we see the implications of the lack of diversity in devices that we use on a day-to-day level, right? So like if let's say we were talking of robotics that was being used in factories, right? Like each of us was not going to face the consequences of mistakes those machines were making, right? But like with machine learning, we let's say like your handheld devices, facial recognition technologies, but all of us are using them. And so I think we need to, it's really not possible to overhaul this pipeline over 5 years, 10 years. Hiring in STEM basically retaining people in STEM has been a challenge. And to that extent, like I agree with Laetitia, like we do have to have like more we need to have solutions and frameworks that people who are already existing and who are already in the industry can work with, right? And so maybe strengthening those and eventually we can probably get to a time work towards increasing the diversity, but you can't sort of distinguish AI as an industry from the social, economic, political background of all the countries. So like if you don't have great education systems and if you don't have STEM, high school STEM learning, like I don't think you can hope to eventually just have a great STEM hiring pipeline at the graduate level. So I think there are a lot of like underlying sort of institutional frameworks that need to be figured out as well, if we want this industry to be robust too. So this is in addition to all the great points that everyone has mentioned already.
Yeah, I mean, great to sum it up as well. But like, you're definitely right. What we're looking at, like systemic issues that sort of transcend industries and move across specific areas. It's not limited or localized to AI and research in that space. Rohan, I saw you nodding along quite confidently, so I'm hoping you have some things to add.
Yeah, thanks, Raj. And it's it's great to be among such incredible panelists and hearing such interesting perspectives. In fact, I would like to, I think, build upon what Tarunima just mentioned around and offer some perspectives around how can we improve the agency of especially women in AI in general and inside the tech industry, because I think some of those systemic issues, unless those are solved, a lot of these other solutions being offered might just offer peripheral benefits. So often we talk about the skills gap in gender gap in AI, and we feel that it's no different from the rest of the technology industry. There's some truth to it, but I think if not watched, the gap in AI may actually exacerbate some of the gender gaps in just economic participation of women, because AI is increasingly in demand skill set. So for example, I think there are initiatives to attract women to the STEM fields, but then we also need to be able to reskill women who work alongside AI augmentation tools and technology. So for example, I think with voice AI, for example, penetrating the customer support domain, we can't have women in BPOs not knowing what the basics of AI. So I think a lot of the skill building in technology also has to now take into account how AI is changing stuff. The second is, I think within technology startups, we also we think about fair representation and inclusion policies for women, but it needs to be guaranteed across domains and also vertically. We need more women in leadership roles, especially in AI companies. And with leadership roles, the third thing I think in which we often think about, at least at Wadhwani AI when I worked there, was women need not be just the builders of the AI technologies, but also end users. So if you're building something for farmers, for example, how do we add an element of gender diversity in it and inclusion of women farmers as well? So I think that's the other lens that we need to put in when we are constantly searching for different use cases and vetting data. And I think the last thing I'd also say is a bit about the culture in some of these startups. I think product development is often associated to be, it's considered to be like a cutthroat activity, high velocity, assumed to be pretty synonymous with like an alpha male persona. And women are often relegated to less influential roles, or the ones which require more empathy. And so I think this needs to be solved. Obviously, there are a lot of solutions, but this is often not in the fore of the discussions. So I think just thinking about the culture within these tech startups might also address some of these issues.
And I think thank you first of all, Rohan, for touching on something really important, which is like looking at some of the ethical considerations about how we apply this technology. Now, Doctor, I understand that you're currently working at UNESCO, looking at the ethics of artificial intelligence. I'd love to bring you in to get your perspective on the topic so far.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for having me. Very nice to be here. Yeah, I think honestly that the diversity question is the $1 million question that we have heard, like very different and super important and unique points on its like intersections and how do we kind of like start to tackle it. And I agree that it's a super hard challenge. It's not easy. You cannot just expect to increase all of a sudden the number of women developers if we don't encourage women to go to computer science schools to begin with. It's just not feasible. And I think, but I'm glad, and I mean, I'm a very optimistic person by nature, so I prefer to look at the the full half part of the cup. But I'm glad that there is a lot of interest in this topic recently rising in all, really across all stakeholders. And I think that tackling the AI diversity issue will really solve a lot of the problems related to bias and to fairness and to explainability, because it's a human nature to, to design the technology in a way that will comfort us. I mean, if I have to design algorithms in a way, I would do it in a way that I'm familiar with, in the way that I mean, it's it will be looking like the people around me, like, because it's what I know. This is my experience. And my boss, when I was working before my journey in technology, used to have a very like good example for how, the importance of this issue, that we use. I'm from Israel originally, and we used to do like a reform in the use of cash. So there is a limit on how much cash people can have at the moment. And there was our colleague representative was in the discussions, was saying like, okay, and the discussion was going into really limiting the amount of cash. And the colleague said like, well, but I mean, in the Arab community, it's not common at all to use like credit cards for like small, when you go to the grocery shop, something like really small. It's just like really completely culturally different. Is it so? And I mean, people just don't think. What I want to say basically is that people don't really think about those issues because it's like so far from them. So in a way, tackling the diversity problem would mean that we will have less bias AI, because right now, for example, if we look at content moderation, that is a very kind of common problem that AI is trying to tackle. We noticed that there is a huge difference in the way that AI detect correctly misinformation in English compared to how it's been treated in other languages. So the percentage is like huge. Like so why is that? Because I mean, as we said before, the languages, because the AI is trained to work as its best in English, and because there are less resources for developing contents in other languages. I'm not even talking about that is the case even for like widely spoken languages in the world, like Arabic. I'm not even talking about, languages that like minorities, only a couple of million speaks, or I don't even want to imagine how there could be algorithmic content moderations for those languages. So basically, just to sum it up, I think that that this is really the question to focus on, and for the next couple of years. I'm happy that you brought it up in this important panel, and I wish us all good luck in really moving this on a policy side, on a technical side, everyone to whatever they work at.